So Dr. Sally Weintrobe is a psychoanalyst and chair of the International Psychoanalytical Association's Committee on Climate Change. She is the author of Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, Neoliberal Exceptionalism, and the Culture of Uncare, co-author of Climate Psychology, A Matter of Life and Death, and editor of Engaging with Climate Change, Psychoanalytic and Interdisciplinary Perspectives. Dr. Weintrobe is a fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society and a longstanding member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. She was formerly an honorary senior lecturer at the Department of Psychoanalytic Studies at the University College London and a member of teaching staff at the Tavistock Clinic. Her book, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, elicited these comments from Harriet Wolff, president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Sally Weintrobe uses her psychoanalytic mind and her sociocultural experience to create a brilliant presentation of intersecting historical, political, economic, and psychological determinants of the climate crisis. Dr. Wolff continues, she uses personal, clinical, literary, biblical, sociological, economic, and scientific information and metaphors to bring alive the overwhelming realities of ecocide and denialism. Her detailed elaboration of neoliberal exceptionalism and the current Western culture of uncare sets what she terms, quote, the bubble of disavowal in bold context. Her own care for the safety of the planet and its human and animal inhabitants permeates the aspect of this book that inspires the reader to face the crisis and become an agent of change. Dr. Weintrobe?
Thank you. Thanks very much. I should just say that I never finished my PhD, so I can't claim to be a doctor. I wish I had, but there we go. Okay, I took a clinical path at that point. Anyway, so I'm going to give you my paper, and I have to do a bit of fiddling now to get it up for myself. So don't make a mistake here. Right, here we go. It's called On Impasse, Reflections on the Rising Crazy. First of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me to this conference. And I think your program is very exciting and I hope to attend some of it. Thank you. So to begin, I want to begin with right now, our moment in history. 2 days ago, the BBC reported that the limit of 1.5 degrees temperature rise set at Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009 will likely be broken by 2027. Some climate scientists say we have already crossed this highly dangerous threshold. My area of study is how denialism drives denial of climate reality. Denialism is industry-funded boosting of climate denial. And climate denial includes negation, disavowal, and implicatory denial. So just to go back, negation, it's a hoax. Disavowal, it's happening, but you know, it doesn't really matter because, and implicatory denial, it's happening, but nothing to do with me. Current rising forms are isolationism. Look at all these crises everywhere. Of course, climate change is very serious, but you know, that's just going to have to wait because of X, Y, and Z crises. Meanwhile, the climate crisis is driving all those crises. And finally, I'll mention distraction. Climate crisis is very real and upsetting, but you know, I'm just thinking about this thing that's just been brought to my attention. Scandal, excitement, whatever. So I've argued that denialism has largely operated in our era through instilling a culture of uncare, meaning a culture that actively seeks to uncare us. So in this talk now, I will focus on impasse as a psychological state, arguing that creating impasse to block change towards greater care is denialism's chief aim. An impasse is a state of deadlock, standoff, being mired, stalemated. Impasse can be fermented in the individual mind and crucially also in social groups. The term is used when something that has been developing normally is suddenly blocked and delayed. Impasse aims to block our ever deepening understanding that burning fossil fuels leads to the collapse of life support systems and to ecocide. The stakes for life survival were well understood when the 1.5 degree limit to global warming was thrashed out at Copenhagen. It was a political compromise at the time. The world is already out of balance and reaching tipping points. The reality-based community stepped up then and has been hard at work to create solutions, chiefly how to transition from fossil fuels. And I want to look back to a conference I attended in 2013 at the Royal Society in London. Its name is a bit of a mouthful, the Radical Emissions Reduction Conference. For 2 days, I listened to expert after expert after expert in person and online from around the world outline how different sectors of the global economy could operate using renewable energy. All the speakers essentially said the same thing, that with difficulty, we can achieve decarbonization and with existing technology, but it must happen now. That was back then. I had not realized that decarbonization was technically possible, and I wondered how much the dominant culture had encouraged me to believe it was not possible. It was exhilarating to see speakers empowered by lively entitlement to flesh out a new world, real, not illusory, powered by renewable energy and with a viable future. I thought if only our leaders listened to scientists and experts like these ones, I imagined a government on the side of life. Instead, lobbyists funded largely by fossil fuel corporations had the ear of governments, and they still do. Lobbyists even attend COP climate talks. There were just over 650 at COP27 in Egypt in 2022, where they work to block change with incessant yes, but objections. And their yes, buts are not the sort that further democratic conversation or thoughtful reflection. Their aim is to create impasse, to slow down, halt or reverse any progress that interferes with vested interests. These yes buts are psychological grenades in the climate war being waged so that a widespread will to act for the good is brought to its knees or fatally undermined. In bringing up the good, I should clarify that I believe humans strive to make progress in the sense captured by Michael Ignatieff in 2011, when he said, progress may be a contested concept, but we make progress to the degree that we act upon the moral intuition that our species is one, and each of the individuals who compose it is entitled to equal moral consideration. This striving is love's principle, the expression of the life instinct, the developmental thrust towards what psychoanalysts call the depressive position, a position in which issues of responsibility, guilt, sadness, and concern are struggled with in the self and in social groups. The central question now is whether we, as westernized modernists, manage to act on the moral intuition that all individuals living now and in the future are entitled to equal moral consideration? Are people living in Kenya now, and for those of us in the global north, are our children and grandchildren entitled to moral consideration? Are other species, are even our future selves, given the rapid acceleration of what is now called dangerous climate change? We're not distracted by the din of disavowal and disinformation. It is clear that the current dominant economic model, its ideology and practice, has allowed no provision for future life for any species. I will repeat that. The current dominant economic model has allowed no provision for future life for any species. The economist Kate Raworth has represented the outcome of this monumental moral imbalance via her donut. It represents the findings of environmental, climate, and social science to date. And I'm going to show you now, if I can share screen. I'm going to minimize this. If I can share screen now, I'll show you Kate Raworth's donut. Desktop. And you should see it now. Share. Can you see the donut, my slide?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, I hope it's big enough. But this is Kate Raworth's donut. I hope you also see my little pointer. And her argument is that there's a safe and just space for humanity. I would include other species as well in there. But it involves respecting limits. And she's got two broad limits. One is an ecological limit, and the other one is a social limit. So there's an ecological ceiling and a social foundation, and the safe and just space occurs when both these limits are respected. Then, of course, she puts the planetary life support systems that need to be within limits on the outside, and she puts all kinds of things needed for social foundation on the inside. She's got health in there. I think actually what's missing is mental health, because there's no doubt that this crisis is driving a huge mental health crisis. But anyway, this is the donut, and this is a model of sustainable economics. But this is the actual state of the donut, and this was several years ago. What you see is considerable overshoot in the ecological, in planetary life support systems, and also at the same time as that in the social foundation. Both systems are now out of balance, and because limits have not been observed. I think her brilliance is to actually integrate the social and the ecological and organize it around limits and a safe space in which to live. So I'm going to stop sharing now and go back to, this is a very shocking picture, of course, and it's worse now than it was then. Stop share. So here we are. Document 9, get my paper back up. So for all individuals living now and in the future to be entitled to equal moral consideration, real limits must be accepted as real. Now, reality is a contested subject, an idea, and different disciplines, it's a contested idea, and different disciplines, philosophy, natural sciences, approach it somewhat differently. Freud essentially saw reality as that which, by being there, stands in the way of, impedes, disrupts our wishful fantasies. It shatters fond illusions. It is precisely when real limits are confronted that psychic conflict is triggered. The conflict is between our caring, reality-based part and the part that embraces wishful fantasy. That part, the latter part that embraces wishful fantasy, can make limits just disappear. Well, apparently. So turning to limits, psychoanalysis situates successfully negotiating limits as key to mental and moral development. Psychoanalysts have explored and charted how the mind apprehends limits at different stages of development. Centrally, oral greed, anal mastery, phallic triumph, and the Oedipal drama, centrally a conflict over accepting limits. Accepting limits and working that through at each of these stages presents considerable challenges, not least because each developmental drama remains contemporaneous as a potential in the psyche. The iconic picture of Donald Trump as a huge helium balloon of Trump baby in a nappy soaring over London during Trump's visit to London vividly captures oral, anal, and phallic triumph over limits in one. The South American indigenous leader Alton Krennic described the drool, a moment when the baby, having released the nipple and having gained a brief picture of mother as actually there in the world, in her own right, not subject to baby's oral control, repudiates that view and clamps back on, again, rather than face what is a terrifying moment. Will baby, fragile, vulnerable, and needy, survive beyond its illusory control of the mother? At the macro scale, it could be argued, and I do in Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, that humanity has been in an extended drool for the past 50 years, ever since it was shocked into seeing that there are limits to the amount of greenhouse gases it's safe to pump into the atmosphere, to the damage planetary life support systems can sustain without the consequences being ecocidal, to what Earth can provide each generation of life. Also vitally important at the social level, there are limits to what human beings can tolerate and suffer. Trauma studies proliferated in the post-Second World War era. It was becoming clearer that too much suffering can overwhelm the mind, and it can require generations to work that suffering through so it can even gain representation. We saw this with Holocaust studies, and I suggest we see this bursting through with Black Lives Matter, with colonial reckonings, with Me Too sensibilities, with each generation able to shoulder, to bear a portion of past generations' deep suffering at exploitation, sorrows, and unfulfillments. Jonathan Lear raised the question, can mind inherently bear all things? His context was more specific and conscribed than mine here, but his argument supports a growing understanding that limits are real and apply at the psychic and social as well as the planetary level. Kate Raworth's remarkable donut gives us a snapshot of key limits to observe for life to survive. Awareness of real limits threaten to shatter our belief in the power of omnipotent thinking to abolish all obstacles, to preserve illusions, and Canute-like to block change. Having godlike powers, we can alter reality, as if. Emerging awareness of real limits also dented our omniscience. A particular insult to our sense of omniscience was the emerging view from science of Earth as a vastly complex, interconnected system, not subject to our control and beyond our capacity to understand. This perspective was hardly new, but it would seem to have been largely lost in our era by those in power. I want to talk now about the murder of time. Awareness of limits presupposes accepting transience, that time passes and that this has effects. Maintaining the drool requires obliterating time and time's framings. In the dynamic unconscious, there is little, if no appreciation of time. Regressive tides pull backwards any movement towards recognizing time as real, ticking, and in limited supply. Disavowing real time is a major tactic used by oil lobbyists. That way, they can continue to profit from extracting fossil fuels. That way, there is no time for delay is trumped by, oh no, there is still time to delay. The carbon limit is rendered a mere faint line in the sand to be easily washed away with omnipotent thinking. We are gods, and we determine what reality is. Limitation, line, what line? I just made it disappear. Of course, what is really disappeared is seeing the violence and the suffering that ignoring the limit brings. The target to meet is halving net carbon emissions by 2030, and many governments, including the United Kingdom, responded with targets of net zero by 2050. But net is not real. It includes carbon offsets, 90% of which have proved so ineffectual that carbon offsetting is revealed as a scam. One of the major delay tactics that the fossil fuel industries have mastered is to block achieving real carbon reductions, real zero, by encouraging disappearing the limit with perverse accounting. The way that the oil companies' lobbyists relentlessly push to ignore the carbon limit is termed predatory delay. Predatory delay practiced by the oil industry is on a scale and with destructive consequences never before seen in human history. It is very well documented now that Exxon scientists predicted with great accuracy back in the 1980s the harm their product would cause. They systematically covered this up and funded a culture to encourage mass collusion with the cover-up. In effect, they seeded a climate bubble, a collective psychic retreat from reality. Inside the bubble, harm, violence, death, and any personal responsibility is bleached out. Precisely the apparent eradication of conflict with omnipotent thinking that Searles in 1972, way back then, had warned is so dangerous to life and to liveliness. Turning now to impasse itself and concentrating on its psychological aspects, I'm going to explore two kinds of impasse. The first actively blocks accepting real limits in order to drive predatory delay. It is narcissistic in character. The second kind of impasse is the tragic consequence of the first. As damage mounts, which it must when real limits are flouted, accepting reality becomes increasingly hard. It requires working through how facing climate reality leaves us feeling, processing guilt, grieving, and dealing with trauma. I believe the rising crazy we are witnessing in geopolitics is in considerable measure due to the tragic effects of both kinds of impasse on the mind and in the world. Impasse often crops up in psychoanalysis when discussing other concepts. However, it might be said that a large portion of analytic theorizing has, mostly indirectly, been devoted to impasse, growing out of Freud's monumental analysis terminable and interminable, and growing attention to pathological psychic organizations and their links with destructive narcissism. Rosenfeld, who wrote explicitly on impasse, pointed out that impasse may reappear in force towards the end of an analysis, where the oldest battles are refought and the last chances for deeper communication are grasped for. These situations can appear as negative therapeutic reactions, while beneath the surface, we see a strengthened ego with lively entitlement testing its wings before flying solo without the analyst, with the narcissistic self mounting an impassioned last-ditch attack on settled change, which is, of course, detrimental to its interests. Impasse has been taken more and more seriously with growing awareness of the limits of what psychoanalysis can achieve and the severe effects of trauma on the capacity to work through and beyond impasse. And in concentrating on two forms of impasse, I begin with the destructive kind that I argue is behind predatory delay. My argument is that destructive impasse is driven by a particular kind of pathological psychic organization. So turning to pathological organizations, I have likened climate disavowal to a collective psychic retreat that I call the climate bubble. The climate bubble is a particular form of pathological organization designed to block concern for the environment whenever that concern will threaten vested interests. It is culturally and ideologically embedded, and it is maintained by social group pressure. I've characterized dominant neoliberal culture and I believe we need to be strong enough to grasp that psychopathy lies at the heart of the deadly climate impasse that we are seeing today. Psychopaths are highly skilled at grasping the real picture, but for the purpose of evading reality out of self-interest, they can spot a limit and a boundary acutely. Indeed, they look out for them as threats to find ways to flout them, not to bow to them. They are masters of the dodge and the loophole. Hence, we saw that Exxon knew full well that the devastating impacts that fossil fuels would have right back in the 1980s. They knowingly sowed doubt and promoted disavowal and disrespect for climate science and climate scientists. They helped grow the climate bubble that caught most of us up in believing in an illusionary world. They needed to be grim-eyed realists to do this, but their eye has been paranoid, not depressive. However, is it not delusionary to see climate reality clearly on the one hand, while not believing it will ruin the lives of one's own children? This can only happen by murdering time or subjecting it to warping. The analyst Betty Joseph, back in 1960, had described the psychopathic state as one in which, quote, profound guilt, profound persecution, and actual criminality are constantly being evaded. He achieves balance and inner stability through powerful dramatizing fantasies based on massive splitting and projection. Joseph was describing a pathological organization driven by incessant greedy cravings and criminality. She also pointed to the squandering that this state entails. My work on exceptionalism draws on her ideas and also centrally on Freud's elucidation in 1916 of a character type that he called the exception. Freud's exception relies on perversion and disavowal to avoid experiencing any loss and diminution. I argue the exception is the psychopathic organization driving the impulse to flout limits. So saying more about the exception in very broad sweep feels narcissistically entitled to idealize self and in-group, claim the lion's share for self and in-group, and not be morally troubled by these arrangements. Indeed, to see self and in-group as on the moral high ground. Being superior, it must be morally superior too. A major problem the exception faces is ethical, as exercising its felt entitlements has adverse consequences with moral implications, namely, idealizing the self necessarily goes with devaluing the other. And claiming more for the self necessarily means less for others. The exception's chief felt entitlement is to recast reality by using omnipotent modes of thinking, such as disavowal, turning a blind eye. It should be exempt from having to face moral problems. The exception feels entitled to ride roughshod over any limits to self-idealization, to possessions, to limits imposed by basic fairness and morality. The exception feels entitled to be accepted from having to struggle and having to fit in. It figures, I'm entitled to exemption. Why? Well, just because I'm me. And being me, I'm superior and I'm worth it. And so are all in my in-group. The exception typically resorts to the quick fix solution of rearranging reality to make boundaries disappear. Guilt, shame, and anxiety are disappeared as these feelings are natural breaks to greedy excess. The natural tendency of the exception, when not held in check, is to inflate its status to a god. Exceptionalism characteristically bleaches out the violence and the criminality of its behavior, and crucially, it tends to be casual about killing. It very often stokes grievance that fuels narcissistic entitlement to impose its will, and with its penchant for ignoring limits, its grievances can become limitless too. I'm going to turn now to entitlement attitudes as part of fleshing out the picture. A sense of narcissistic entitlement is key to understanding the exception's will to power and will to drive impulse to stay in power. Without narcissistic entitlement, I'm entitled, destructive narcissism would not endure. My argument is that narcissistic entitlement provides the fuel, the power, the will for the psychopathic organization to enforce impulse. Kriegman had earlier distinguished between three kinds of entitlement: exaggerated, what he called exaggerated, I call narcissistic entitlement, normal entitlement, and non-entitlement. However, it was Murray who recast exaggerated entitlement as narcissistic entitlement and embedded it within a theory of narcissism. Narcissistic entitlement is the kind felt by the exception. That work was done in the 60s. In 2004, I distinguished between narcissistic and lively entitlement, with lively entitlement providing fuel and willpower to the caring part of the self and to its depressive concern. Non-entitlement, an abject state of the caring part, is when the exception has won the struggle with care. The exception will inevitably seek to create impulse when it is challenged. Think of the toddler in a strop refusing to fit in with the family's plans. The narcissistically entitled exception inherently abhors, is threatened by, and wants to destroy limits, meaning limitations and curtailments to the scope of its narcissistic entitlement, which it keenly feels. Exceptionalism is old in human history, underpinning caste, race, and gender exploitation, revealed in the Hebraic Christian position that man, and it is man, shall hold dominion over all he, and it is he, surveys. Exceptionalism entails a controlling property relation with everything surveyed. It's mine to use and, if I so choose, to abuse, but also a self-aggrandizing expansionist vision. It powered the colonial project, and it can arise on the left and the right in politics, which I think is a crucial point to remember. In the 1980s, exceptions gained control of politics and economics and unleashed an economic model designed specifically to boost exceptionalism, to set it free of all limits. Their monumental deregulation from care's restraint has led in just 40 years to the physical and social climates tipping out of balance. Exceptionalism destabilizes nature, psyche, and community. It disrupts balance in all these complex and interwoven systems. It seeks to undermine whatever and whomever threatens the scope of its ever-expanding ambitions. It is the embodiment of what Hannah Siegel called the anti-mind approach, one that creates impasses to thwart any engagement with moral struggle and painful working through. Our era from the 1980s has seen the rise of a culture of uncare, meaning a culture aiming to liberate our inner exception and to undermine our reality-based caring part that holds it in check. This culture's precise messaging has suited the interests of a neoliberal, fossil fuel profit-driven economy. It encourages us to stay manic and experience light, L-I-T-E, to have a nice day, unconcerned with and feeling no responsibility for the staggering damage this very economy is doing to people, to planet, and to non-human animals. Neoliberalism's culture of uncare has further alienated us from nature and from community, two great natural bulwarks against inner and group exceptionalism. In order to appreciate the impasse that is driving predatory delay, it is vital to include the exception's insistence on being in charge, in control, and its stubborn refusal to give an inch. The exception is not for turning, a phrase made famous by Margaret Thatcher. It idealizes a ruthless, hard man, adamant quality, abhorring any weakness and claiming it would rather die in a ditch than give up its entitlement, which, to repeat the point, is essentially entitlement to bypass real limits with omnipotent thinking and expectations. To succeed, the exception must wield sufficient power to enforce impasse, in other words, to win a battle with the reality-based caring part of the self, the group, that seeks change towards the good. We face a power struggle between care and uncare, truth and lies, liveliness and deadly intent, a matriarchal or patriarchal principle, the impulse to connect and share versus disconnect and grab unfairly, to follow the reality principle or omnipotent thinking, whichever way one poses it. My focus is on the kinds of will that power this struggle. Now, returning to that climate conference held back in 2013, I'd been stunned to realize that a transition to renewable energy was indeed possible then, and that the transition was largely being stalemated by a dominant culture that was currently winning its war on care and care's values. The issue was the will to change. Did care have enough willpower to withstand being demoralized by the current culture. The psychoanalyst Eric Brenman once said, it requires considerable strength to withstand omnipotence. And this is true in the world as well as in the clinical encounter. Strength is needed to value depressive concern and to restrain narcissistic entitlement to flout limits, to withstand a culture that valorizes and funds uncare and that regularly casts care as a snowflake, an abject, mocked, non-entitled, poor relation. Indeed, increasingly as something dangerous. And above all, that a culture that normalizes stripping care's funding to the bone. The culture war to block change is, of course, unevenly fought across many opposing flanks, subcultures, and power blocks. However, looked at in the overall, things have not been going care's way in our new century, one that has seen at the manifest level progressive mental deregulation and demoralization. Round about the year 2016, this began to be called the crazy, and the crazy has been rising. Nonetheless, there are signs of care's resurgent in recent times, and we see this in the greater general understanding of corruption and perversion lies in politics, in a renewed respect for democratic institutions and worldwide post-war frameworks of care, such as the United Nations. Also, in the rise of protest, climate protesters, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Indigenous people, youth against gun violence. Care is saying enough is enough. Non passeront. Uncare has gone way too far. We must protect life and liveliness. The pathological organization would have us believe that the working through needed for change has not yet begun. Another demoralizing tactic, I suggest, and far from true. Much working through has and is being undertaken by the reality-based community. I'm just wondering about the time, so I'm going to skip something. The eminent climate scientist Kevin Anderson said something at that conference back in 2013 that landed with me. It was that we were in a radical situation. Either we address the climate emergency, or by changing, or the climate emergency would unfold at pace and change everything. Either way, we would not avoid change. The question now being, what sort of change? Breakthrough or breakdown? I remember at the time thinking that while Anderson was stating the absolutely obvious, this would not land with people still caught up in the climate bubble, for whom nothing needed to change, apparently. The real tragedy is that this would lead them to continue causing collective harm, bringing about Anderson's second kind of change, accelerating climate and social breakdown. And 8 years later, we see this latter scenario unfolding. The climate bubble seems to be following the usual pattern with bubbles, but with two key differences to, for instance, the financial bubble. The damage this bubble is causing is far larger and more consequential than any beforehand. And this time, those driving impasse will not be able to bail out. They will be affected. They cannot bail out, except with delusional thinking that they can survive in bunkers or jet to Mars. This needs qualifying, as many of those blocking needed change, particularly in the global north, will likely be able to protect themselves in the short term. The cost is abandoning their children. It is a structural feature of pathological organizations that they seduce and morally corrupt people with perverse arguments leading to harm. And people are not good on the whole at facing and working through their guilt, at causing harm, so they can tolerate bearing it. Very briefly, I want to mention the second kind of impasse.
I'm wondering if we should also leave some time for discussion,
Yes,
Sally?
I'm sorry, I realize. Okay, I just want to say in one sentence then, that emerging from the climate bubble is experienced as a series of shocks, which I go into, And they in turn cause all kinds of psychological impasse at working them through, because they make that working through much, much more difficult. And I think we need to work in groups to be able to process the second kind of impasse. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So please put your name in the chat box if you have a comment. There's a lot to talk about here, a lot to process. Let me start while people are sort of organizing their thoughts. Let me start with a question or comment. I've been trying to sort of make sense of everything you're saying through the lens of my own thinking as a political scientist. It's to me a very rich picture that you've crafted here of the psychology of how mass psychology and the psychology of the leaders, elite psychology, sort of conspire to reinforce this plight that we're in. And I'm wondering, the way I think about this, that the leaders are, as in almost every domain of politics, attempting to manipulate mass psychology.
Yeah.
And the challenge for us, the people, so to speak, is how do we create a mass movement that breaks out of this manufactured consciousness and addresses the reality. I'll stop there and see if you have any further thoughts on that.
Yes, I don't think there are any easy answers to that, but one of the things I think is crucial is to recognize the exception within. Because unless we do that, we're going to flip into getting caught up in blame games. Of course, we can all point to the oil industry and leadership, political leaders and their ideology and so on. But I think that the healing part comes with actually getting in touch with what's happened within ourselves. I increasingly believe that. And I think that we need to do that in groups, because I think it's too unbearable to face on one's own.
Thank you. Yeah.
Because we collude. And,
right.
And this manipulation relies on our collusion.
Right. Thank you. Rachel Udelman asks, is a transcript available? We will produce a video recording of this talk, and it will eventually be available. We're hoping to post it on the internet. And anyone that participates in this discussion, if you don't want your comments and interaction with the speaker to be on the internet, you need to let us know. Then I have Diane Perlman with a question.
Hi, thank you. That was excellent. And I went to the first Earth Day. I went to the climate conference, COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009 with Mediators Beyond Borders. And our mission was to identify climate conflicts and to work on, mediating them to reduce problems. And I also have a patent on a reusable collapsible cup. So I've been zero waste and I carry my own stuff with me. I'm the only person I know that does that. So anyway, that said, that the whole issue, that there's a problem that the issue of climate is being exploited by forces. And this is something that I've learned about recently and some people are waking up to, like with the World Health Organization, 15-minute climate cities, or using it to capture people's data and to, have surveillance and control over how much you spend or how much meat you eat. So a lot of progressives who are, say, very into climate are now looking at the exploitation of it. So mystification is a plausible misrepresentation of reality where forms of exploitation are presented as forms of benevolence. So that's interfering with, I guess, having more people on board. So
Thank you,
Are you-
Diane.
Okay.
We have other people who want to speak, so let's
Okay.
hear from Sally and then, yes.
I think another very crucial aspect of this is waking up to just what a fraudulent, corrupt system we're living within. You know, I think it's very painful, but I think it's necessary to understand that at this point in history. But thank you.
Thank you, Nick Duffel.
Yeah, so I wanted to build on your question a bit, Brian, about what do we do about the leadership? Because I think while Sully's right, it's not about blaming, but it's like actually we've got a couple of really big issues that we could do something about, and the first one is the sort of the bridge between the politicians and the public is the media. And I've been trying without success to get interest in how do we educate the media to spot the politics and spot and name the politics of dissociation and the politics of projection. And I think we, in psychology, we've got this very powerful tool. And because our profession has been so busy squabbling with itself over the last 100 years, the general public hasn't had the benefit of that. We should be educating our journalists psychologically so they can do that. That's the first thing. And I don't know how you go about doing that, but I think it's very poor. I remember in the general election 2010, speakers were allowed to come on the BBC and say that Gordon Brown was responsible for the world recession, and nobody stopped them. So there's something we have to do with the media. And the other thing is about education of our leaders. And I'll be talking tomorrow. My talk is all about education of leaders. One thing I got from the work of Ian McGilchrist is who is very interested in sort of how the left brain hemisphere takes over in culture. And when you have hyper-rational education systems, such as we do in Britain, which educate our elite classes, you are overtraining the left brain. And Sally said something towards the end of her talk about the grabbing. And Ian McGilchrist's work says very, very, very clearly that if the left hemisphere takes over, there's a sort of grabbing reflex. The left hemisphere controls the grabbing reflex in the right hand, and if the more left hemisphere oriented, we grab, and I think so. We're sort of building in the way we educate our elite in this hyper rational training, this grabbing reflex, and we can stop that.
Thank you, Nick. I think we have we're almost out of time, but Sally, if you want to take 1 or 2 minutes to respond to Nick and make any further concluding comments, we'll be at the end of our time.
I agree with both your points, Nick. I would say that it's helped me greatly. My training as being a psychoanalyst has helped me greatly to understand the pressures of, trying to withstand disavowal as practiced by the media, and it is part of the culture of Uncare. It is designed to keep certain groups in power. And so when you work as an analyst, you understand that disavowal is the real thing. In the moment, there's no talking to it. And that's what I meant when I said, Eric Brenman said, it takes great strength to withstand omnipotence. There's no way around that. I think it is very hard to get voices into the main streets, the press. And, I've had some success. And these days, I've actually got journalists contacting me because they're finding climate reality so unbearable that it's very hard for them to work as climate scientists. They need support. But this is a very, very intractable issue. But I would say, we are up against it. That is our moment now, and we need to understand that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sally Weintrobe. Thank you.